Yu-Gi-Oh is the greatest card game ever made, and now I'm going to tell you about the best format the game has ever been played in. It combines the chaos and strategy of free-for-all clashes like the one at the Duel Tower, with the power fantasy of going into combat alongside your favorite monster like the Deck Masters of the Virtual World arc. Prepare to brew up a deck that will help you seize the glory of victory, cause it's time for Domain Format Explained. Part 1. What is Domain Format? Upon first hearing the name, you might think this variant is all about recreating the era of the Emperor of Darkness structure deck, featuring one of the most infamous field spells of all time, Domain of the True Monarchs. But nothing could be further from the truth for hilarious reasons. Domain Format is a free-for-all duel generally played in 4-player pods, where each player at the table takes turns developing their game plan to beat their opponent and take home the gold. But it's not just the number of opponents that shake things up, there are 4 key differences that change how you play the game. First, your main deck is composed of 60 cards, no more, no less. Second, each card in your deck has to be unique. Effectively, every card in the game is limited, which means your deck is going to be made of 60 unique different cards. Third, in addition to your 60 card main deck, you'll also have a Deck Master, a monster that'll helm the strategy of your deck, taking advantage of some unique mechanics to keep you one step ahead of your opponents. And fourth, the cards that you can include in your deck depend on your Deck Master. While all spell and trap cards are available for everyone to use, including ones that are forbidden in other formats, the monsters you can include will be dictated by the domains provided to you by your Deck Master. Part 2. What is a Deck Master? The Deck Master is a monster of your choosing that'll gain special properties and will help you in constructing your deck and defining its identity. But what monsters can be your Deck Master? Well, any of them. Whether they usually start the game in the main or extra deck, and whether or not they have pendulum scales, any monster can start the game face up in your Deck Master zone, ready for action. But how do you get it out of that zone? Well, that depends on the monster. If it's your run-of-the-mill main deck monster, you can summon it from the Deck Master zone with your normal summon like it's in your hand, or tribute summon if it's got a high enough level. If the monster has a summoning condition, you can also summon it using that condition, also as if it was in your hand. Though keep in mind that a monster that can only be summoned by its condition still has to be summoned that way. Being a Deck Master doesn't let you bypass that. Which is the perfect segue to talk about Ritual Monster Deck Masters. These are also pretty simple. If you have an effect that can ritual summon a monster from your hand, the monster in your Deck Master zone is a viable option. Extra deck monsters are also pretty simple. Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, and Link Deck Masters can be summoned like they're in the extra deck from the Deck Master zone by following their same conditions. Pendulum monsters are really fun to use too. In addition to summoning them like the previous examples for all applicable versions, you can activate them right to your pendulum scale from the Deck Master zone. You can even pendulum summon your Deck Master as if it was in your hand if the level fits into your scales. Though keep in mind you still have to follow any summoning restrictions of the Deck Master. You won't be able to pendulum summon Destiny Hero Plasma, for instance, or any of your extra deck monsters for that matter. That includes extra deck pendulum monsters like Fusion Pendulums or Xyz Pendulums. Those monsters also can't be activated straight from the Deck Master zone as pendulum spells. A good rule of thumb is, if the card couldn't exist in your hand, you can't do anything from your Deck Master zone you couldn't normally do from your hand. And if that monster could exist in your hand, then it has to follow its usual rules. But having early access to your Deck Master right out the gate isn't the only benefit they have, it also ensures you have constant access to them. Anytime a Deck Master would change a play area, so from the field to the grave, or from the grave to the banishment, or from the pendulum zone to the face-up extra deck, after any change resulting from that are finished, the owner of that Deck Master has the option to return that monster to the Deck Master zone as an action that doesn't start a chain. This means if you have a strong normal summon, you can ensure it's part of your opening plays, and if it leaves, you can ensure its normal summon is reloaded again for later turns. It also means if you have a powerful boss monster, but have difficulty recurring it after it's been lost, you can reset it to your Deck Master zone to make it again. And there's no limit to the amount of times you can do this per turn or game. If you have multiple normal summons, or continue to have the resources to make your extra deck monster, you can do so again and again. It almost sounds too good to be true, and That's right, there is one caveat. The first time you summon or activate your Deckmaster from the Deckmaster zone, it's free, but every time past that, you incur an increasing 500 life point cost that you'll have to pay to perform the summon. So the second summon will cost you 500 life points, the third will cost you 1,000, the fourth 1,500, and so on and so forth. So unless your deck has a strong life gain component, and with your opponents gunning to take down your life points as quickly as possible, you'll want to make sure you balance how many summons you perform over the course of the duel with other sources that'll drain your life points. The one thing that Deckmasters cannot do is activate their effects from the Deckmaster zone, nor apply any continuous effects from there, which thankfully means no The Last Warrior from Another Planet shenanigans. This is because the Deckmaster zone, which I'll be referring to as the DMZ from now on to save on syllables, is its own place separate from the field, the grave, anything like that. And since no cards have effects printed on them that work in the Deckmaster zone, it'd be like trying to activate an on-field effect while a monster is still in your hand. It's basically a non-starter. This does cause some issues with certain Deckmasters, as some will have inherent summoning conditions that still function, like Cyber Dragon, while others use activated effects to summon themselves from the hand that aren't going to work, like Transcendosaurus Meteorus. As a result, you'll want to look very closely at how your monster's effects are formatted. If the summoning condition has a colon or semicolon, that means it's an activated effect, so no dice. But if it doesn't have one of those, you're in the clear. Part 3. How do you find out your domains? Alright, now that we've gone over all the awesome things you can do with your Deckmasters, let's cover perhaps their most important function, their domains. For a monster to be included in your main or extra deck, it must include at least one of the Deckmaster's domains. Domains come in either one of 4 kinds. The first 3 are archetypes, attributes, and types. Attributes and types are pretty simple. The ones printed on the monster give you those domains, and if the name of the monster includes an archetype, you can add any monster of that archetype to your deck as well. So even though Beat, Bladesman for Hire, gives you the domains of Earth and Warrior, you can still include a non-Earth, non-Warrior monster like Philo, Messenger for Hire, because they're still a monster for hire. For domains purposes, an archetype is a name that's referred to in the effect text of any other card in the game. So if a card searches for a Batteryman monster, or revives a True Draco monster, that's a legal archetype to be a domain. It's also worth noting that if an archetypal name includes another archetype inside of it, you get that domain too. So Infer Noble Knights also gives you Noble Knights, which doesn't affect too much since basically all of them are warriors. However, any of the various hero sub-themes also grants you the base hero domain. So if you play one hero as your Deckmaster, you can basically play all of them. But it's not all upsides. As it turns out, there are some commonly known cards that share a name but don't actually have any archetypal connections. One example is digital bugs. This group of light insects don't actually refer to each other in any of their effects and just use their type and attribute combination, so you can't actually get digital bug as an archetypal domain. But the biggest one is also the most ironic given the format's name. Monarch is not an archetype, and thus cannot be granted as a domain. Go ahead and take a look. Every time one of their associated effects refers to a monster, it's always checking for the stat line of the monster and not a name. Now, the spell and trap cards do mention Monarch spell and trap cards, but they never mention Monarch monsters. And perhaps slightly less nitpicky, the OCG version of those spell and traps are Emperor cards, not Monarchs. Now, it would take forever to go over each and every little facet of this rule and how it applies, so I'll be linking a Google Doc made by one of the format admins that goes into the quirks of how certain archetypes are handled, and that should give you all the info that you need. The fourth is a bit more niche, but does come up from time to time. If a specific monster is listed in a card's effect text, that can also be included in your deck as well. For example, Guiding Quem the Virtuous has Fallen of Albaz in their domain because it specifically lists that in their effect text. Oh, and speaking of effect text, that's also a place domains can be found. If a specific monster name, archetype, attribute, or type are listed in a Deckmaster's effect text, those are added to the domain as well. So while Vanquished Soul Rocks is a Dark Pyro monster, it also adds Fire and Earth to your domain, since it has those attributes listed in its text box. Though notably, it does not grant the Rock domain, because all mentions of Rock are part of the monster's name, not the monster type. Oh, and there's one really cool rule I forgot to mention. The Egyptian gods cannot be contained nor rebuffed by any domain, which means any deck can play any divine attribute or divine beast monsters. This is also a way to make it possible to even use those cards, since nearly no cards outside of the god cards would give you divine or divine beast as a domain, and running them as your deck master would severely limit your deck building options, making it a fun extra rule that's functional and flavorful. It's also important to go over a couple of things that seem like they should be domains, but aren't. First up, monster abilities do not grant domains. For the uninitiated, abilities are those things that you see on a monster's type line that give it some kind of classification, and these are Spirit, Flip, Union, Tune, and Gemini. Pendulum and Tuner aren't abilities, but they tend to be talked about in the same context as abilities, so keep in mind that just like how having a fusion monster as your deck master wouldn't give you access to all fusion monsters, any of those 7 do not give you a domain for card inclusion. So you'll have to get a little bit creative if you want to have a flip deck and include all the Wake Cup monsters. Having Subterror Guru isn't going to cut it. You also might have heard that if a monster lists a particular stat line in its effect text, that gives you its domain. This was relevant for several cards like the Visas Hearts that would list 1500 attack and 2100 defense, or how the Charmer Pals would synergize with monsters that have 1500 attack and 200 defense. That was an old rule, but has since been phased out. Part 4. How do you play domain? So you know what a deck master is, what it can do, how to find out your domains, and how to build a deck for the format. Now it's time to actually play the game. The usual setup is a pod of 4 players, but can be played with as few as 2 players, and as many as however you want. Just know that it will take a lot longer to resolve the game. You'll need to sit with each 2-player pair sitting across from each other to complete a traditional dueling field. Columns are only shared with the 2 players facing each other, which means in odd-numbered games, or when someone is knocked out in an even-numbered game, someone is going to end up with an empty field across from them, especially since no one will reposition to take over any empty seats from knocked-out players. So be sure to know your play group before going in with your Mech Knight Magical Musket deck. Find a random way to determine who will go first, then proceed around the table in a clockwise order as turns progress. Each player will start the game with an opening hand of 5 cards, with each player drawing during their first draw phase, even the duelist that goes first. Players will take game actions as normal, with the last in the turn rotation being the first one to get a chance at the battle phase. Priority also works much like it does in regular Yu-Gi-Oh, but instead of going back and forth between 2 players, it instead passes clockwise from the turn player. Player A might activate an effect, with player B electing not to respond, but player C does choose to chain a card effect. This will start a new round of priority, giving player D, then A, then B a chance to respond before C gets another chance to activate a card or effect. Once a full rotation of priority happens without anyone choosing to activate anything, the chain closes and resolves as normal. This puts an additional complication for cards that require you to activate an effect in response to another one of your own effects. Thunder Dragon Titan is a infamous example. And in Domain, there's now 2 other players between you and your next round of priority to interrupt you from triggering Titan's effect. So you might want to do a little politicking to help incentivize your other players to hold off on the effects until you get the destruction trigger online. Aside from that, play works exactly like regular Yu-Gi-Oh! You can attack any opponent or their monsters, you can target those monsters with card effects, you can tribute their monsters for kaijus. It's the same Yu-Gi-Oh! We know and love, just with more dueling happening, with even more varied decks. But there is one major difference, and that's, well, the card text. Part 5. Reading the card explains how to explain the card. In general, cards with single targets are easy to parse in domain format. But what if an effect has multiple targets? Or something has an effect that works on all of my opponent's monsters? Do I get to hit all 3 of my opponents with those? Well, not usually. If an activated card or effect mentions your opponent, you have to select an opponent as part of activating that card or effect, limiting its usage to that opponent. However, if a card uses the word each or both, this now becomes all, affecting everyone at the table. A good example of this is the difference between Darkhole and Raigeki. Raigeki reads, destroy all monsters your opponent controls. Since it mentions your opponent, you have to pick one player, and all of their monsters get destroyed, while the others are unscathed. Meanwhile, Darkhole reads, destroy all monsters on the field. It doesn't specify an opponent, so it hits everyone, including your other 2 opponents, as well as yourself. The same logic can also be applied to targeted effects. If a card says target X number of cards your opponent controls and destroy them, you can only target cards controlled by one of your opponents that you choose. But if a card says target X number of cards on the field and destroy them, any cards on the field are fair game between the players. This also comes up when resolving trigger effects, like most trap cards, though not exclusive to them. If a card's activation and effect mentions an opponent, then it has to be the same opponent for each part of the effect. A great example here is Mirror Force, which reads, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, destroy all of your opponent's attack position monsters. So if player A attacks with a monster aimed at player B can respond with Mirror Force, but can only choose player A as the one who gets their attack position monsters destroyed, as they were also the player that triggered that effect. Notably, even though they weren't targeted, player C can also choose to activate Mirror Force, since the activation condition doesn't specify where the attack target is directed at, but player C will still have to destroy player A's monster because they were the player that triggered it. This is in contrast to cards like Jelly Cannon, which reads, when a monster declares an attack, target a monster on the field and shuffle it into the deck. There's no mention of an opponent on the resolution end, so player A can attack player B, at which point player C can activate Jelly Cannon to shuffle back one of player D's monsters. That being said, these rules do not apply to continuous effects. If a continuous effect specifies an opponent, it applies to all opponents, so feel free to get wacky with Wonder Balloons. It'll be debuffing all of your opponent's monsters. Part 6. Frequently asked questions. That basically boils down most of the surface level stuff you need to play Domain. Get your cards and your friends together and have yourself a fantastic time playing Yu-Gi-Oh's best format. If you want some practical examples of how the game is played, I've got a whole playlist of Domain duels, the show where I drag all of my friends into a game of the best format Yu-Gi-Oh has to offer. But for the rest of the video, I'm going to be running through many frequently asked questions to try and cover as much info as I can so you can be as well informed as possible. However, I will be sticking to technical questions, and I'll be making a follow-up video later on about more esoteric questions at a later date. On screen, I'll have some timestamps for some questions I've already covered in the video. Now, let's get on to the new stuff. Is there a way to play Domain format online? There sure is. Currently, there are 3 big ways to play it. The first one is, if you and your friends have your actual cards, you can just set up some webcams and remote duel. The second one is a little janky, but I've had some success with it. Dueling Book. Currently, there's no supported function for it, but with a little bit of retooling, you can make it work. Basically, each pair of players will start their own game in Unlimited, leaving it open for spectating. Then, in a separate tab, each player spectates the other pair's game, making sure to communicate any decisions that would affect the board not in their own game. This is best done over a chat client to help communicate, but presumably you could use the in-browser chat function to handle that. The big downside is that you can't actually play a true Domain deck there. Since DB doesn't have a way to play cards over the 60 card maximum, 15 for your extra deck, you will have to take out a slot from the appropriate deck to fit your deck master into. From that point, it's recommended you banish your deck master and treat that as your deck master zone, sharing space with the rest of the banishment. You'll also want to make sure to take actions periodically outside your turn to keep from getting booted for inactivity. And note that if you lose the game, you can't really leave. Otherwise, your game partner will get booted as well. Like I said, it's pretty janky, but you can make it work, though there are a lot of hurdles to jump over. The last way to play is also the one that requires an actual financial investment, but it is my favorite, Tabletop Simulator. This is a way to play tons of board games and other activities with friends, and there's actually a custom-built Domain format table ready to play. And I'll have a link to that table in the description. It's got 4 dual fields for a standard size game of Domain, with locations on there to snap your cards to help keep the play area clear and easy to read. It's got plenty of dice and coins to support your chance-related deck, and it's got an import function to bring over decks from your favorite programs like Dueling Book, Edo Pro, and more. But yeah, you do have to sink $20 into it plus tax. And there's not a way to share the game if you have it, so every person that wants to play will have to have their own copy. Now the good news is that there is a bundle for 4 copies that costs $60. So if you and 3 friends can pull that amount together, you're basically getting 1 copy for free. And now you have a program you can use to play Domain, as well as a ton of other awesome games. So personally, I think it's well worth the investment. Not sponsored, by the way. Our deck masters summoned from the deck master zone treated as though they were summoned from their appropriate zone, i.e. the hand or extra deck. Surprisingly, no. While we can treat them as being in the hand or extra deck for the purposes of summoning them out from the DMZ, they are still summoned from this new zone. This means that effects that trigger when summoned from the hand or extra deck actually won't trigger, which is bad news for cards like Fluffle Dog and Hugin the Runic Wings. But on the plus side, this does dodge relevant summoning condition restrictions. If Branded Fusion is locking your extra deck summons to only fusion monsters, you can still synchro summon Ecclesia of the Black Dragon from your Deckmaster zone. It also means you never have to worry about Molcharmies hitting those summons, which is a huge plus. Do I have to return my Deckmaster to the Deckmaster zone when it leaves the field? Nope. While you have the opportunity to do so whenever your Deckmaster changes zones, you don't have to. But be warned, those brief moments are the only times you get to recall your Deckmaster, so if you miss your window, it'll be stranded in that zone until it gets moved again, in which case you'll get another chance to recall it to the DMZ. Do I have to pay life points to summon my Deckmaster from any zones besides the DMZ? Not at all. If your Deckmaster winds up in your hand, you can summon it as normal without having to pay the cost, same for summoning it from any other zone. Can I play a copy each of Harpy Lady 1, Harpy Lady 2, and Harpy Lady 3 in my domain deck? Sadly, that's a no. Since Harpy Ladies 1, 2, and 3 all have text that treats them as Harpy Lady all the time, all 4 of these cards compete for the single singleton slot available for Harpy Lady in your deck. Kind of like how they would fight over the 3 slots of Unlimited in advanced format. Now, this does not affect monsters who change their name while in certain zones, like other Harpy Lady monsters and Gunkan Suship Shari Red, but you will need to make some important decisions in regards to deck that run a card like Umi, or the new Albaz. If a card references another copy of itself, am I allowed to play another copy of it so the effect can function? Once again, that's a no-go. To maintain consistency with how the advanced format works, there's no exception that allows you to start the game with multiple copies of a single card in your deck, even if the card basically doesn't function without other copies of that card. If a specific monster is listed in my Deckmaster's text box, thus adding that monster to my domains, does that Deckmaster then provide the domains of that listed monster? No. Outside of the Divine Beast clause that lets you play the Egyptian gods in any deck, there is no way to add domains outside of what is listed specifically on your Deckmaster. If a monster doesn't have an archetype in its name, but mentions another archetype in its effect text, does that base monster become a member of that archetype? No. When determining a monster's archetype, we only check any information provided by the name. One example would be Cross Keeper, a monster whose effect includes Elemental Hero and Neospatian in its text. This does not make Cross Keeper either of those archetypes, so if your Deckmaster provides either of those domains, you would not be able to play Cross Keeper in your deck by itself. Your Deckmaster would also need to be either a Dark or Warrior monster to provide a compatible domain. That being said, if Cross Keeper was to be your Deckmaster, it would provide the archetypal domains of Elemental Hero, and Neospatian, potentially making it a great Deckmaster for those themes. Exchange looks really funny to play in this format. How the heck does it work? This is going to be a fun one to answer. Exchange reads, both players reveal their hand and add one card from each other's hand to their hand. Because it's domain, both becomes all. Now, without any structure, this could devolve into some unfathomable nonsense, but thankfully, there's a specific way to resolve this. All players will reveal their hands. Then, starting with the player who activated Exchange, player A, they'll pick a card in the hand of the next person in turn order, player B. Then, player B will do the same to player C, C with D, and finally, D with A. Once all cards have been selected, each player will take the card that they chose from the other player's hands into their own, all at once. Drag Down to the Grave works in a similar way, except the chosen card is discarded before everyone draws a fresh card. Similar structure to when you resolve Gift Exchange or Creature Swap. So, have fun making everyone touch each other's cards. When an opponent is removed from the game, what happens to their cards? When a player loses the game for whatever reason, all their cards are removed from the game. This includes all cards on their field, hand, graveyard, decks, and banishment, as well as any cards owned by the removed player currently on another player's field. If the player controlled any cards owned by their opponent, those cards are returned to the appropriate zone under their owner's control. or sent to that player's graveyard if there are no available zones. If that player has any effects on the chain, those effects will be removed without resolving them. However, any lingering effects that may have applied will continue to do so, like with the card Eradicator Epidemic Virus. If any lingering effects had a duration that would end on that player's turn, that duration is then moved to the same time on the following player's turn. Heat Wave is an excellent example of such a card. If player A activates a Heat Wave but is removed before their next draw phase, the effect will instead last until the next draw phase of player B's turn. It's also notable that a defeated player's cards leaving the game is not classified as any other kind of removal, and will not trigger the effects of other cards that look for cards leaving or moving to another zone. If I have a continuous effect that depends on a quality of my opponent, which opponent does it check? All of them. If a monster gains attack based on the number of monsters your opponent controls, like Gyakugiri Panda, it'll get buffed for each monster that each opponent controls. This gets a little tricky when you involve monsters like Ancient Sacred Wyvern, which gains attack depending on how much higher your life points are than your opponent, but also loses attack if your life points are lower than your opponent's. In this situation, you tally the difference between you and each different opponent and apply all of them at once. If you have 2,000 life points more than player B, 1,000 more life points than player C, but 500 less than player D, Ancient Sacred Wyvern will gain a total of 2,500 attack points, gaining 3,000 from the opponents that you have higher life points than, while deducting 500 based on the opponent that has more life points than you. What if I don't like any of these rules? That's arguably the best part. You can ignore any of this that you want. A domain format is here to be as fun as possible for as many people as possible. So if there's something about the established rules that you and your playgroup don't like, feel free to change them as you see fit. This would be one of those Rule Zero conversations you might have heard about, but that can cover a wide umbrella of things that you talk about with your playgroup before you get started. You might want to talk with them about the power level of certain decks to make sure they're on a relative even level so that the game is interesting. And you might also want to discuss certain rules changes you'd like to see to enable certain kinds of decks. For instance, if you don't like that rule about Harpy Ladies, you can just ignore it. Play every copy of Harpy Lady that you want that's always treated as Harpy Lady. Heck, I've done it for Nouvelles. That way you can play the original and the new Hungry Burgers. Want to make Monarchs a domain so you can play them all together? Feel free to toss in Squire and Vassal as domains while you're at it. Want to allow 3 Destiny Hero Maliciouses or Thunder Dragons so those decks function? Go to town! Domain is there to do with as you see fit, so don't be shy about changing things around to fit your particular playgroup. Just remember that communicating with your playgroup is the most important part, and not many people are going to find it funny that your Snake Eyes and Azamina cards all fall under the same White Forest lore domain. Now, I would find that funny personally, but that's just the lore guy talking. And that about covers everything I've got to teach about how domain format works. In the description, I'll have links to the domain format website, which has a number of resources you can use, including a tool that checks what domains any monster gives you, and a list of domain-specific rules. There's also going to be a link to the domain format Discord, so you can connect with other duelists to play Yu-Gi-Oh! In the greatest way there is. Today's episode is brought to you by Dragon Shield. Get the sleeves as strong as dragon scales and save 5% on your order by using the coupon code GoldenNova at checkout while helping out the channel. It was also brought to you by my lovely patrons, including this month's illustrious Quasar Commanders, Upstairs Media and the Critic of Innocence, Nebula Navigators, 3rd Dynasty, Ada Basilisk, Adam Zajdel, Ancient Wizard, Andrew Newman, Battle Axe, Beastsman, Charlie Mercury, Chibi Gohan, Christopher Fuss, Clockswork, Comrade Kapapam, Eric, Frankie, Great Big Pillock, Groog, Hairbear, Harry the Ominous Benefactor, Iron Zero, Iskander 711, Carp, Marion James E. Picata, Meme King, Muse Clark, Orozco 09096, Panther J, Pat Poos, Rebel King Lucifer, Red Eyes Jackalow, RJ the Jank Monarch, That One Dumbass and the Wizard Moose, Cosmic Crusaders Animasta, and Thorak, a random pup, Blitzwolf, Chaz Ghost, Christopher Fuss, again, Cool Trainer Dark, Dr. Entity, R.I.P., Eki Bullock, Eva Padilla, Herbal D, Inblink, J.A. Flair, Julian Marquez, Kale the Dragon, Kryptonian Blurred, Lobomaru 02, Manga Pages, Millennia Asta, Mr. Machina, Natia Lee Alexander, Neon Yaminer, Nicholas Murphy, Not Algor, Obsidian, Rhyme Kairos, Rogue Wolf, Seraph SG, Shizuka Nijimura, Simic Toadstool, Sonic 21 Blast, Stepfen Huntsman, the Legendary Raven, the Queen of Time, Tiger X2476, Tristan O'Meara, Zadine, Zaldreka, Yazuz 1, Zephyrath the Rock Thing, and Zentha, as well as all the lovely Starlight Explorers you see on screen now. If you'd like to help me in my journey to cover all of Yu-Gi-Oh's archetypes, get my videos early, be a part of these credits and other awesome perks, it would mean the world to me if you would check out the link to my Patreon in the description or consider joining as a YouTube member. And if you want to see some more domain duels, this is one of my personal favorites, if only for the fact that we get a little time with everyone's favorite Brooklyn Brawler. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.